So a lot of people might not know this, but many childcare centers operate on razor-thin profit margins. How have they been surviving?
The childcare industry before the pandemic was it was an industry that was having a lot of trouble surviving, and the people who work at childcare centers are lucky if they're making minimum wage. You're completely right, they operate on razor thin margins. And the problem is that almost half of the childcare workers are actually living on public assistance themselves, and they can't even afford childcare for their own children. We are losing $57 billion a year currently before the pandemic because of the lack of childcare. So this is a problem that was already affecting our economy, already affecting Americans across the country, and the pandemic has exacerbated the problem.
So as you mentioned then, it was underfunded before, and we did see that the childcare industry requested $50 billion in stimulus relief to help it survive the pandemic, but the $2 trillion CARES Act included only $3.5 billion. Why do you think there is this lack of funding, and what are the arguments for asking for more funding?
There's this lack of funding because we don't have enough elected officials who understand how the rest of us live our lives. Right now, childcare, it actually costs more to send your infant to childcare, to a daycare center, than it does to send your teenager to college. If we had more working parents in office, we would have more people who understand this. So you're completely right. They asked for $50 billion and they got $3.5 billion. Meanwhile, the airline industry got over $60 billion. It's a lack of understanding of where our priorities should be, because a lot of people will look at the childcare industry and they'll think, oh, that's a women's issue. That only affects women. It only affects children. The reality is it's an economic issue. And what will happen when the country starts to open up more and people will start to go back to work? Where are they going to put their children? Daycare centers are closing down. Over 300,000 daycare centers have already lost their jobs. And we just heard from childcare workers, people cannot afford to keep their centers open. So people will not be able to go back to work, and the unemployment crisis will get even worse.
And so you raise an important issue there, because without daycares, what other issues then does that create for working parents, and then the ripple effect that comes from that if more parents have to stay home?
It's funny. You see, everybody has now gotten used to these Zoom meetings and talking and doing work over the computer, and you now see all of these children always in the background. Every Zoom meeting I have, somebody's child walks in, and people are now understanding what it's really like to juggle taking care of your child. Everybody is trying to homeschool and work, and it's hurting people's ability to continue to grow their business, to go back to work. We're talking about places opening up again, but people will not be able to go back to work if they don't have a safe place to leave their children. And there was a recent survey that actually showed that about a third of daycare centers won't survive for more than 2 weeks shut down. So we've seen a lot of states actually provide subsidies for childcare for essential workers, but that is not helping the people who will need to put their children back in daycare when they go back to work. They've asked for $50 billion, and even the new stimulus bill, the HEROES Act, has only provided $7 billion. It passed the House last month.
Right.
It would provide $7 billion, but I don't think that'll pass the Senate. And even if it does, it's still not enough.
And obviously the conversations are still ongoing, but we have seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed many states to consider implementing emergency universal childcare policies to support essential workers. So talk about some of the state initiatives and any sort of momentum that you're seeing.
It's interesting that they're doing this now. I mean, Arizona and Maryland are two of the states that have done this, but there are some states that are providing emergency universal child care. There are also some states that are providing subsidies for essential workers. The last time we saw a push like that was actually during World War II, when mothers had to go to work and men were off fighting in the war. They actually passed the Lanham Act and provided thousands of child care centers, universal child care. But when the war ended, they shut down. And that was the closest we've ever come to this. And it's a very similar push right now, with states actually stepping up and saying, all right, look, people are working and they can't afford childcare centers, and the childcare centers can't afford to stay open when they don't have enough children in them. So the states have actually stepped up. We've seen it across the country in a few states at least. There's about 5 or 6 of them that have had programs like this, but it's not enough. It needs to be a much larger scale solution.
So just very quickly then, any lessons that the US can learn from how other countries are handling their childcare systems?
Absolutely. You talk about childcare being an economic issue. If we had similar labor force participation rates to countries like Canada or Germany, we'd actually have 5.5 million more women in our workforce and add $500 billion a year to our economy. Those are countries that have subsidized quality childcare. The childcare centers here are exorbitantly expensive, and in many cases are not even safe for children. There's only about 10 states that require universal background checks. We need to look at childcare the way that other countries do, the way that we look at public education. It needs to be a universal program that everyone has access to childcare. You know, everyone has access to school from the age of 5 on. It should be the same from the 0 to 5 age range. Otherwise, we're losing out on GDP. We're losing out on the growth. We're losing out on people going back to work. It's actually the first time since the 70s that the percentage of women who are actually choosing to stay home after giving birth is increasing. And it's frankly because of the lack of childcare and the cost of childcare.